In May 1945, soldiers of the Soviet Red Army and the U.S. Army celebrated on the banks of the Elbe River, about 100 miles west of the bombed-out ruins of Hitler's Berlin. The Allied powers, known as the United Nations, were on the brink of winning the war in Europe, and in the process cutting their foe, Nazi Germany, in two. That August, an American B-26 named the Enola Gay, after the mother of pilot Colonel Paul Tibbets, would drop the world's first atom bomb on the city of Hiroshima, killing approximately 66,000 inhabitants and injuring more, many of whom would succumb to radiation sickness in the coming days, weeks, years. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki helped compel Emperor Hirohito to capitulate, and on September 2nd, Japanese representatives signed the instructions of surrender on board the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Far to the south, another sort of gathering was taking place on that very same day. A young man standing in Ba Dinh Square stood up before teeming masses of his fellow Vietnamese to declare their country's independence. He proclaimed, quote, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All the people on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live and to be happy and free." The nom de guerre of this young Vietnamese man was Ho Chi Minh. No one knows if these assorted actors knew that this meeting of allies, this devastation of a city, and this recitation of Thomas Jefferson's anti-colonial masterpiece would lay down the lines of force that would divide and define the world for the next 45 years. Scholars tend to call the period of time running from the victory in Japan Day on August 15, 1945, to the dissolution of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day, 1991, as the Cold War, though it would be 2 years after the war before Walter Lippmann, an American journalist, introduced the term to describe an emerging ideological and geopolitical rivalry between the United States of America and the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, also known as the Soviet Union. Lippmann called it the Cold War because it appeared to be neither peace nor war. This long-running antagonism would indeed split the world between the forces of capitalism and those of communism, with the divided country of Germany and its former capital, Berlin, standing at the heart of a superpower standoff that more than once seemed on the verge of descending into all-out war. Today I will discuss the Cold War's military, diplomatic, and geopolitical features, as well as its legacies for international security today. To structure our thinking, I will break up the subject into 3 shorter periods of time and outline 3 geographical patterns that will help us to understand the Cold War's multifaceted character. In short, I want you to leave here today with knowledge of America's Cold War, but also an appreciation for why the Cold War meant and continues to mean such different things to so many different people. I will begin with the former. How do we define the Cold War? The conventional narrative reaches back to those Soviet and American troops converging upon each other in their race for Berlin. The pattern and balance of forces between the armies of the United States and its West European allies, Great Britain and France, and those of the Soviet Union split Europe roughly in half. A series of summits in Tehran, Cairo, Yalta, and Potsdam during the Second World War among Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and his successor Harry S. Truman, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his own successor Anthony Eden, sought to foster agreement on how the peace would be constituted once the war against the Axis powers had been won. The disproportionate amount of battles waged by the Red Army in Soviet territory and then in Eastern Europe as it fought its way toward Berlin, together with the lateness of the Western landings at Normandy in summer of 1944, however, meant that Soviet forces now occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, as well as large swaths of Austria and Germany. While the Western powers could not help but recognize the facts on the ground, namely Soviet military control over Eastern Europe, they still pressed for, quote, free and fair elections, and thereby a measure of influence in the region. Stalin, however, was unwilling to see potentially unfriendly regimes established on Soviet borders after a ruinous conflict that had killed more than 20 million of his citizens. Coups in Poland and Czechoslovakia, over which the Second World War had ostensibly been fought, and a crisis in oil-rich Iran over the withdrawal of Soviet forces there, stoked mistrust and hostility between the two emerging superpowers, whose societies would come to see their former allies as their foremost foes, freezing the division in Europe and bringing about a Cold War confrontation across the globe. Those states depicted in blue on this map would join the United States and Canada in a military alliance known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, while those drenched in red would form the Warsaw Pact under Soviet protection. West Germany would join NATO, while East Germany would join the Warsaw Powers. As reflected by this map, the division of Europe in what came to be known as the German question, that is, when and how these two superpower blocs would normalize relations with the two Germanys, since most of these countries remained technically at war through 1975 with Germany, was primarily a European or Atlantic matter. However, the Cold War was indeed a global phenomenon. As Europe teetered on the brink of war, the two sides would find outlets for their competition in what was known at the time as the Third World, which scholars today call the Global South. The Second World War bankrupted the British, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Italian, and German empires. As a result, many new nation-states arose from the imperial ashes in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Asia, beginning with the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947 and concluding with the collapse of Portuguese control over Angola in 1975. The historic opposition of the United States and Soviet Union to colonialism helped hasten this process. During the Cold War, however, the two superpowers would compete for influence in these new states, showering money, investments, food, advisors, military supplies, and political backing on a slew of often authoritarian governments. This battle for the soul of mankind had three consequences. First, early on, European imperial powers were able to cast their colonial struggles as Cold War fronts, persuading audiences in Washington, D.C., for example, to support their efforts to put down colonial insurrections in places such as French Indochina, including Vietnam. Second, these post-colonial spaces were susceptible to becoming Cold War battlefields themselves, as the superpowers funneled money and material to their chosen sides in places as far afield as Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, and Israel and Palestine. Sometimes these proxy wars threatened to escalate into full-fledged superpower conflicts. For example, in Cuba, where Soviet support for Fidel Castro and American efforts to reverse the Cuban Revolution there culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the two superpowers came closest to waging thermonuclear war. Finally, power-hungry leaders in the Global South often use the Cold War as a justification, as a lure, to attract capitalist and communist powers to direct arms and investments their way, altering these countries' political and economic destinies. Though American audiences often see individuals such as Ngo Dinh Diem, Ho Chi Minh's US-backed rival in Vietnam, as puppets, more often than not, political actors on the Cold War periphery were pulling the strings of officials back in Washington and Moscow. Finally, the Cold War was truly a global event whose impacts rippled around the world. This is perhaps most apparent in the massive stockpiling of nuclear weapons by the United States and the Soviet Union. At one point, the two supreme nuclear powers fielded upwards of 50,000 nuclear weapons, enough, one American military officer remarked, to bomb us back to the Stone Age. Other global processes were also accelerated, however, such as climate change and environmental degradation, international finance and trade under the contemporary heading of globalization, and relatedly, international communications, as US and Soviet military spending financed the creation of the world's first space programs, a planet-circling network of man-made satellites that would enable technologies such as global positioning and mapping, weather forecasting, and boundless instantaneous communication, as well as DARPANET, the forerunner of today's internet funded by the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Just as the Cold War needs to be looked at from multiple geographical standpoints, our historical eye also benefits from breaking it up into smaller periods of time. These periods will help us make sense of the events, people, and ideas that shaped the age. First, I would characterize the succession of events that precipitated the falling out between the Soviet Union and the United States as occurring between 1945 and 1949, by which time the Soviet-American antagonism had hardened into place. Let's call this the descent. Next, the world experienced a series of crises in Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, Berlin, and finally Cuba from 1950 to 1962. We'll call this the period of crises. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the turning point. From 1962 to 1979, the Eastern and Western blocs slowly yet steadily broadened their contacts and improved their relations, despite the Americanization of the Vietnam War. The major events in this period of relaxation were the entry into force of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970, Nixon and Kissinger's opening to China in 1972, and the Helsinki Accords that officially ended the Second World War in 1975. Though some scholars prefer the term détente, a French diplomatic expression meaning relaxation, here we'll use a broader formulation, coexistence. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 brought an end to this coexistence, precipitating a return to Soviet-American antagonism. However, the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev to power in the Kremlin and a shift toward more cooperative policies by US President Ronald Reagan helped diffuse the situation. This time, however, détente would prove revolutionary instead of evolutionary, as the sad state of the Soviet economy and the political grievances of captive populations in Eastern Europe, combined with Gorbachev's own reform efforts to end Soviet rule over Eastern Europe and, soon after, the Soviet Union itself. For this reason, these 12 years can best be understood as the climax of the Cold War.